She belongs to me, and every man in this town knows it." Victor Kane's voice cut across the Millbrook courthouse like a blade loud enough to silence 63 people in a single breath. He pointed at Evelyn Harper with the casual certainty of a man who had never once been told no and fully intended to keep that record intact. Evelyn didn't step back, didn't lower her eyes. For the first time in 3 years of running, of hiding, of swallowing her own name, like it was something shameful, she stood completely still, looked Victor Kane directly in his iron eyes and said 4 words that changed everything. "I belong to myself, friends." Before we go further, if this story already has your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and follow Evelyn's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The stagecoach driver didn't even slow down. Evelyn stood at the side of the trail with her arm raised, her traveling bag at her feet, and the Wyoming sun pressing down on her like a punishment. She had been walking for 6 hours. Her boots had worn through at the left heel 2 days ago. The blisters had long since stopped hurting, which she understood from something she'd read once meant the damage had gone deeper than feeling. She watched the stagecoach roll past without so much as a glance from the driver. She lowered her arm. She picked up her bag. She kept walking. This was not the first time the world had looked straight through her. At 27 years old, Evelyn Harper had been looked through so many times she had almost started to believe she was made of glass. Her mother had looked through her. The lawyers who handled her father's estate had looked through her. The man her father had promised her to, Victor Kane, with his fine suits and his cold, flat eyes, had never looked at her at all. Only at what she represented: a piece of land, a cleared debt, a transaction dressed up in a wedding veil. She had run the night before the ceremony was scheduled. She had taken only what she could carry, a carpet bag. Her father's old account ledger, the small amount of cash she had managed to save over 2 years of quiet, careful planning, and she had walked out of the house in Cheyenne before dawn while Victor Kane slept 3 rooms away. That had been 29 days ago. The money was gone now. Had been gone for 11 days. She'd sold her mother's brooch for enough to eat for a week, then sold the account ledger to a trading post owner who didn't know what it was but liked the leather binding. She had worked 3 days mucking stalls at a relay station outside of Laramie for $1 and a meal, and then the relay station owner's wife had come home early from her sister's house, taken one look at Evelyn's face, and told her husband she wanted the drifter woman gone by morning. So Evelyn had gone. She didn't blame the wife. She understood how things looked. She understood how things had always looked for her, which was to say, wrong, out of place, suspicious. A woman traveling alone in Wyoming territory in the summer of 1884 was not a woman anyone rushed to help. She was a woman people crossed the street to avoid or stared at openly from doorways, or spoke about in low voices while they thought she couldn't hear. Where's her husband? Must have done something shameful. Women don't end up alone on the road for no reason. She had heard all of it. She had kept walking through all of it. But by the afternoon of the 29th day, she could feel something she had been trying not to feel for nearly a week. The particular quality of fear that is not sharp and urgent, but slow and heavy. The kind that settles into your bones when you finally begin to understand that you may have miscalculated how far a person can go on stubbornness alone. She had no money. She had no contacts in this part of the territory. She had no clear destination, only the general understanding that she needed to get far enough from Cheyenne that Victor Kane's reach wouldn't follow her. She had been told by a woman at a church in Casper, who had fed her a bowl of soup and asked no questions, that there were small homestead communities farther west where a woman with bookkeeping skills could sometimes find honest work. Sometimes. That word had been doing a great deal of heavy lifting in Evelyn's mind ever since. She crested a low ridge and stopped. Below her, following the curve of a dry creek bed, a ranch spread out across the valley floor. She could see cattle in the far pasture, a main house modest and square, a barn, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, a water pump near the house that made her throat ache to look at. She had not had clean water since yesterday morning. She stood on the ridge for a long moment, calculating. She had knocked on 4 ranch doors in the past week. The first rancher had told her there was no work and not to come back. The second had offered her work of a kind she had pretended not to understand, and then understood very clearly when his hand found her arm, and she had left that yard at something close to a run. The third rancher had a wife who had been kind, but frightened, and the husband had come home in the middle of their conversation, and the wife's face had changed so completely that Evelyn had thanked her quickly and excused herself without being asked. The fourth rancher had laughed, not unkindly, exactly. Just with the casual dismissal of a man who found the situation more amusing than concerning. A woman your age alone out here, no horse, no money, heading west. He'd shaken his head. I don't know whether to admire you or feel sorry for you. Neither, Evelyn had said. I just need work. He'd still been laughing when she left his yard. She looked at the ranch below her now. The cattle looked healthy. The fences looked maintained. Someone was working here, working hard by the evidence of it. That meant there might be something she could offer. She started down the ridge. She made it about 2/3 of the way down. Later, she would not be entirely clear on what happened next. She remembered her vision going strange at the edges, not darkening exactly, but thinning like paper held up to light. She remembered her knees giving without warning, the ground coming up fast, the dusty scrub grass against her cheek, the extraordinary smallness of the sound she made when she landed. She remembered thinking with the peculiar calm clarity that sometimes comes at the worst possible moment. Well, this is inconvenient. And then, she didn't remember anything at all. The first thing she was aware of was the smell of wood smoke and something cooking. Not burning cooking. The specific warm, savory smell of meat and onions in a pan. The kind of smell that her body responded to before her mind had fully woken up some ancient animal part of her recognizing food. Safety. Stay. The second thing she was aware of was that she was lying in a bed. An actual bed. With an actual pillow beneath her head and something heavy and warm covering her, a quilt she realized dark wool and clearly old, worn soft from years of washing. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was rough-hewn timber. The light in the room was the amber directional light of late afternoon. Her carpetbag was on a chair across the room, and someone had placed a tin cup of water on the small table beside the bed, close enough that she didn't need to stretch to reach it. She noticed all of this. She also noticed the man, who was sitting in a straight-backed chair against the far wall, not looking at her, or rather, he had been looking at something in his hands. A piece of leather tack. He appeared to be stitching, and he looked up when she moved. She put him at roughly 35. Broad-shouldered in the way of men who do physical work without thinking about it. Dark hair that needed cutting. A face that had spent a great deal of time outdoors, weathered, angular, not handsome in any conventional sense, but the kind of face that was difficult to look away from because everything in it appeared to mean something. He had the particular stillness of a man who was comfortable with silence. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You can stay until you're strong enough to leave." His voice was low and unhurried. Not warm exactly. Not cold either. Simply matter of fact, as though he were reporting something that had already been decided. Evelyn sat up slowly. The room tilted a little, then steadied. "How long was I unconscious?" she asked. "About 4 hours." "Did you—" She stopped. Started again. "Did anyone else?" "No," he said. "Just me. Found you on the slope coming down from the north ridge. Brought you in." He said it the way a person might describe finding a fence post that needed fixing. No drama. No expectation of gratitude. She looked at the tin cup of water. She looked at her bag on the chair. She said, "I'll need to compensate you for the trouble." "No trouble. I insist. I don't accept. Nobody pays for kindness," he said. Still matter of fact, still unhurried, as though the conversation were already settled and he was simply waiting for her to catch up. Evelyn looked at him. She had been told many things by many people over the course of her life, and she had learned through long and sometimes painful experience to listen not just to what people said, but to what they expected to receive in return for saying it. Kindness in her experience was rarely a simple transaction. It came with weight. It came with obligation. It came with the unspoken understanding that the recipient would remember who held the debt. She studied his face for the expectation. She couldn't find it. "My name is Evelyn Harper," she said carefully. "Cole Walker." He picked up the leather tack again. "Drink the water. There's food when you're ready." He went back to his stitching, as though she had not been found unconscious on his property 4 hours earlier. As though none of this were unusual. As though women simply materialized in his spare room on a regular basis, and required nothing more than water and a matter-of-fact declaration of temporary shelter. Evelyn drank the water. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust the situation. She didn't trust the warmth of the quilt, or the smell of the food, or the careful placement of the water cup within reach. She had been in enough situations where the surface appearance of safety had proven to be something else entirely. But she drank the water. She couldn't help it. She was so thirsty that her hands shook slightly as she lifted the cup. He didn't comment on the shaking. She ate at his table that evening, a meal of beef stew and cornbread, simple and filling, the kind of food that costs nothing to make and means everything when you need it. He ate across from her and asked her nothing. She offered nothing. They ate in silence that was not uncomfortable so much as careful. The silence of two people who have both learned in different ways that words can be weapons and silence can be armor. When they finished, she cleared the table without being asked. He watched her do it. Not suspiciously, more with the slight attention of someone noting something unexpected. "I'll work," she said, stacking the dishes at the basin. "I'm not a charity case. If you have work that needs doing, I'll do it. Cooking, cleaning, whatever's needed. I can also keep books if your ranch has accounts that need managing." A pause. "You know bookkeeping. My father ran a trading business. I kept his accounts from the time I was 16. I know contract law well enough to read a cattle agreement and tell you if someone's trying to cheat you." She turned from the basin. "I'm not asking for wages, just shelter until I've recovered enough to move on." He considered this. She had the sense that he considered things carefully in general, not because he was slow, but because he had no patience for decisions made carelessly. "Ranch has 3 hired hands," he said finally. "They bunk out back. You'd have the spare room inside." His eyes met hers directly. "Nothing improper about the arrangement. I don't operate that way." "I didn't assume you did." "Some people would." "Some people," she said evenly, "aren't my concern." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one passing quickly. 2 weeks, he said. "You recover, you assess the accounts if you want to, then you decide what you want to do." "Agreed." She extended her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then shook it. His grip was brief and businesslike. That was the entirety of their agreement. Evelyn went to bed that night in the spare room and lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the ranch, settling the distant cattle, the creak of the old house, the wind across the Wyoming plains, and she tried very hard not to feel anything in particular about any of it. Safety had fooled her before. Kindness had cost her before. She was not going to make the mistake of relaxing into this, of believing that the warmth of a quilt and the matter-of-fact competence of a stranger who asked nothing meant that she had landed somewhere she could afford to stay. She told herself this very firmly. She almost believed it. 3 days into her recovery, she asked Cole Walker for the ranch ledger. He brought it to her without question, a battered accounting book, several years old, entries made in a cramped and functional hand that was clearly his own. She sat at the kitchen table with it for 2 hours, while he worked outside, turning pages, carefully running a pencil down columns of figures. On page 47, she found the first problem. A cattle contract from 2 years prior. A sale of 60 head to a buyer named Hargrove, recorded at $9 a head. $540 total, marked as received. But on page 52, there was a second entry for the same contract. 60 head, $9 a head, marked as pending payment. Someone had recorded the same cattle sale twice, once as received, once as outstanding, which meant either Cole had been paid and didn't know it, or Cole had never been paid and thought he had. Either way, $540 had disappeared somewhere. She turned more pages. She found 2 more discrepancies within the hour. Smaller amounts, but the same pattern entries that didn't reconcile figures that had been copied incorrectly or deliberately obscured. When Cole came in for the midday meal, She was still at the table with the ledger open in front of her, 3 pages of her own notes beside it. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her notes. He looked at the ledger. He sat down. She showed him the first discrepancy. Walked him through it methodically, the way her father had taught her, not rushing, not dramatizing, just following the numbers to where they led. Cole was quiet for a long time. "Hargrove," he said finally, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that was different from his usual quietness. Harder underneath. "Do you have a copy of the original contract?" He got up without a word, went to a box on the shelf above the fireplace, and came back with a folded paper. She smoothed it on the table and compared it to the ledger entries. The contract said $9 a head. The ledger entry said $9. But there was a third document in the box, a receipt handwritten from Hargrove, for $480, not $540, $60 short, recorded as full payment. "He shorted you," Evelyn said. "And whoever recorded this in the ledger either made a mistake or helped him do it." Cole sat very still. "How long has your previous ranch hand been with you?" she asked. Another silence. Longer this time. 3 years, Cole said. "And the discrepancies start." She turned to the first problem page. 2 years and 8 months ago. She did not say anything more. She let him reach the conclusion himself, because some conclusions need to be reached alone. He sat at that table for a full minute without speaking. She watched his jaw tighten and release, tighten and release. She watched him absorb something that clearly hurt, not just the money, which was bad enough, but the betrayal underneath it, the understanding that someone he had trusted in his own house had been working against him. She knew that feeling. She knew it with a specificity that lived in her chest like a splinter. "There are 2 more, she said quietly. "Smaller amounts. I can work through the whole ledger if you want the full picture." "Do it," he said. His voice was controlled. Whatever he was feeling had been placed somewhere internal and locked there. She recognized that too. He stood up, put his hat back on, and went back outside. She worked through the entire ledger. By the end of the week, she had a complete accounting. The shortfall across 3 years of small manipulations and 1 significant transaction came to just over $800. $800 was not a catastrophic sum. But for a ranch already operating on thin margins after 2 consecutive years of drought, it was the difference between stability and the kind of debt that forced hard choices. She presented it to Cole that evening on 4 pages of neat, organized notes. He read through it twice without speaking. "You're certain," he said. "The numbers don't lie. People lie. Numbers just reflect what people did." He set the papers down on the table and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite gratitude, or not only gratitude. Something more complicated. The look of a person who has been handed something they didn't know they needed and isn't entirely sure what to do with it. "I can't pay you what this is worth," he said. "I didn't do it for payment." "Why did you do it?" She considered the question seriously, the way she tried to consider all serious questions. "Because someone needed to," she said. "And because I was here." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "The spare room is yours as long as you want it." It was not a grand statement. It was not a declaration, or a romantic overture, or an attempt to imply anything beyond what it said. It was simply the acknowledgement that something had shifted between a stranger and a guest, and that the guest had become something else. Not family, not yet, not even close, but something that had its own particular weight. Useful. She had become useful. She had forgotten without realizing she had forgotten it, what that felt like. She did not cry about it. She was not a woman who cried easily or often. But later that night, alone in the spare room that was beginning to feel less like a stranger's charity and more like simply a room, she let out one long, slow breath that had been sitting in her chest for a very long time. Outside, somewhere in the dark Wyoming hills, a coyote called once and went quiet. And for the first time in 29 days, Evelyn Harper slept without listening for footsteps. The ranch hand's name was Dylan Marsh, and he quit before Cole could fire him. He showed up at the breakfast table. The morning after, Cole had spent the night reviewing Evelyn's accounting notes, and he took one look at Cole's face, that particular quality of stillness that meant something had been decided, and he pushed back his chair and said, "I'll have my things out by noon." Cole didn't argue, didn't accuse, didn't raise his voice. "Leave the keys to the feed barn," was all he said. Dylan left the keys on the table and walked out without looking at Evelyn. She sat across the table with her coffee cup and said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had only reported what the numbers showed. What happened afterward was not her business, but she felt the weight of it anyway, the particular discomfort of being the instrument of something painful, even when the pain was justified. She turned her coffee cup in her hands and reminded herself that the truth was not the same thing as cruelty. She had needed to remind herself of that before. Cole poured himself a second cup of coffee and sat back down. "That leaves 2 hands," he said. "Hector and Pete. Good men. Won't be enough come fall roundup. You'll need to hire. Need the money first." "The Hargrove contract," she said. "Have you considered pursuing the shortage? Hargrove has 3 lawyers and a brother-in-law on the county commission." "That doesn't make him right." Cole looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "It makes him difficult." There was a silence. She could see him calculating not just the money, but the energy, the time, the risk of picking a fight with a man who had institutional protection and could make a straightforward dispute into something long and grinding and expensive. "Let me write the letter," she said. "Evelyn, not threatening, just precise." She set down her coffee cup. "I can draft a letter that lays out the discrepancy, clearly references the original contract, and requests reconciliation. No accusations, just facts." She paused. "Facts are harder to dismiss than anger." He studied her for a moment. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. "My father's business had suppliers who tried to short us twice a year like clockwork. I wrote most of his correspondence by the time I was 19. She looked at the table. "He didn't always listen to what I wrote, but I wrote it." Something passed across Cole's face at that brief and unreadable, the expression of a person filing something away for later consideration. "Write the letter," he said. She wrote it that afternoon. 4 careful paragraphs. Factual, formal, utterly without threat, and precisely that much more dangerous for it because there was nothing in it to argue against. It simply stated what had happened and what correction was required. Cole read it twice, signed it, and sent it to town with Pete the following morning. Hargrove's response arrived 6 days later. A check for $60 and no accompanying note. Cole held the check in his hands for a moment. Then he set it on the table in front of Evelyn. "You were right," he said. "Facts are harder to dismiss." She picked up the check and held it with a careful neutrality she didn't entirely feel, because $60 in her hands at this particular moment in her life was not an abstract number, and she was not going to let herself think about that. "It's a start," she said, and handed it back. She had intended to stay 2 weeks. The 2 weeks became 3, and then a month, and the month became something she stopped counting because counting it felt like the wrong kind of attention. Like watching water to see when it would boil, when the better approach was simply to tend the fire and let things happen at the temperature they required. The work was real, and it was constant. Cole's ranch ran on the principle that everything had a purpose, and everything got done, and Evelyn found herself absorbed into that rhythm with a naturalness that surprised her. She cooked for the 3 of them, Cole, Hector, and Pete, and managed the household accounts, and gradually, without any formal agreement, began taking on the broader bookkeeping for the ranch operations. Cattle records, feed costs, the quarterly tallies that needed to go to the bank in Millbrook. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. But there was a difference between being good at something in a situation where your competence was tolerated as a useful novelty and being good at something in a situation where your competence was simply accepted as fact and built upon accordingly. Cole built upon it accordingly. He brought her contracts to review before he signed them. He asked her opinion on the price of beef futures before making sale decisions. He introduced her to his banker in Millbrook, a careful, formal man named Aldous Greer, as the woman who runs my books, and said it with such uncomplicated matter-of-factness that Greer had extended his hand to shake hers before he thought about whether that was what he intended to do. Small things. But the accumulation of small things had a weight of its own. Hector and Pete treated her with a respectful wariness that gradually warmed into something easier. Hector was 40-something Mexican-born with a dry sense of humor that emerged in short, perfectly timed sentences when she least expected it. Pete was younger, not 25 yet, and had the earnest, slightly overwhelmed quality of a person who was genuinely trying to do everything right and occasionally succeeding. He called her ma'am with such consistent sincerity that she eventually told him her name was Evelyn, and he could use it, and he'd gone pink to the ears and said, "Yes, ma'am, Evelyn." And she had decided that was as much progress as she was going to get. Cole himself remained the most difficult to read. He was not cold. He was not distant in the way of a person who disliked her company. He worked beside her, ate across from her, engaged in conversation that was real and substantive about the ranch, about economics, about the broader state of Wyoming Territory, about books, which she discovered. He read extensively and thought about carefully. He had opinions. He expressed them. He listened to hers. But there was a line. She could feel it, not a wall exactly, but a kind of careful perimeter he maintained around certain things, around his personal history, around his past, around anything that touched on who he was before this ranch and this life and this particular version of solitude. She respected the line. She had her own. One evening about 6 weeks in, she came back from the chicken coop to find him sitting on the porch steps with a letter in his hands. He wasn't reading it. He was just holding it, looking out at the hills in the particular way that meant he was somewhere else entirely. She sat down on the step below his, without asking permission. After a while he said without looking at her, her name was Clara. She waited. We were to be married in the spring of '79. She got sick that February. He folded the letter along its existing creases carefully, with the automatic hands of someone who has folded the same paper many times. Fever, 4 days. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. The letter's from her mother. Every year she sends one on the anniversary. He turned the letter over in his hands. I don't know if she does it to remember or to make sure I don't stop remembering. Maybe both. Howe was quiet for a moment. You lose someone like that, he said finally, and for a long time, the only thing that makes sense is making sure nothing like that can happen again. He glanced at her briefly, which is a very efficient way of making yourself into a person who's useful to nobody. She looked at the hills. I understand that strategy, she said. I've been using a version of it myself. He made a sound that was almost a short laugh. Almost. How's it working for you? He asked. About as well as it probably works for everyone, she said. The sun went down. They sat on the porch steps until it got cold enough that she went inside to start the evening fire, and neither of them said anything more about Clara, or about strategies, or about the particular way that two people can recognize each other across the particular damage they've each accumulated. But something shifted in the air that evening, subtly. The way seasons shift not all at once, but in accumulated small signs that you only recognize later as a pattern. The gossip started in town, as gossip always does, because that is the ecosystem. Gossip requires a gathering place, idle time, and the particular human appetite for making a story out of other people's private arrangements. Evelyn first heard it from the dry goods storekeeper's wife, a woman named Mrs. Calloway, who had the specific gift of delivering information in a tone of such apparent concern that the cruelty inside it was almost invisible. People are talking dear, Mrs. Calloway said, wrapping Evelyn's flower purchase in brown paper with practiced efficiency. About the situation out at the Walker Ranch. Are they? Evelyn said. A woman living alone with a man, no family connection, no chaperone. Mrs. Calloway shook her head. People will draw their conclusions. People are welcome to draw whatever they'd like, Evelyn said. I can't control what people draw. It reflects on your character is all. The woman pushed the package across the counter with an expression of delicate sympathy that made Evelyn's teeth hurt. A woman your age already traveling alone, well. People wonder about history. Evelyn took the package. My history, she said calmly, "is my own business. Is there anything else I owe you?" She walked out of the store without waiting for the answer. But the walk back to the wagon was longer than it needed to be, because she was fighting very quietly, very privately, the particular and familiar shame that comes from being made to feel wrong about existing. She hated that feeling. She hated it more than almost anything else she knew, because she had never found a reliable defense against it. Logic didn't dissolve it. Anger at its injustice didn't dissolve it. It simply sat there in the chest, heavy and stupid, doing nothing useful whatsoever. She put the flour in the wagon and climbed up to the seat. She sat there for a moment in the street. Then she clicked to the horse and drove back to the ranch and didn't mention it to Cole. She didn't mention it the second time she heard it either from Aldous Greer's assistant at the bank, who was young and thoughtless and delivered the rumor without even seeming to realize it was unkind, just mentioning casually that people had been saying that the Harper woman out at the Walker place was looking to get her hands on the land. She didn't mention the third instance or the fourth, but Cole heard them anyway. Small towns have their own particular mechanics, and the Walker Ranch was not invisible to those mechanics. He raised it one evening after supper when Pete and Hector had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet. "You've heard what they're saying in town?" he said. "I've heard. Does it bother you?" She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider honest questions. "Yes," she said. "It bothers me. I don't think it should, and I know the logical arguments for why it shouldn't, and I hold all of those arguments in my head very clearly." She stacked the cleaned plates in the cabinet. "And it still bothers me, because I spent a very long time in a situation where my reputation and my choices and my value as a person were decided by people who had no actual knowledge of me, and that experience leaves a mark whether you want it to or not." Cole was quiet. "I'm not going to ask you to leave," he said, "in case that's what you're worried about." "I wasn't." "Good." He pushed his chair back from the table. "Because the people talking don't work this ranch or pay its bills, and I've never especially concerned myself with the conclusions of people who won't look at the actual facts." She turned from the cabinet and looked at him. There was something in the way he said it, not chivalrous, not performative, just the plain statement of a man who had thought it through and arrived at a position and intended to hold it, that struck her somewhere she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged with the ease of a man uncomfortable with thanks. "Nothing to thank me for." She almost said something more. She had something rising in her throat, something about what it meant after years of having her presence treated as a problem, to be managed to have someone simply say she was welcome to stay, because she deserved to be there, and the opinions of people with nothing better to do were irrelevant. She didn't say it. It was too much for a kitchen conversation after supper, but she held it. The trouble with the neighboring ranchers came to a head on a Tuesday in late September. A man named Roland Pierce arrived at the ranch without sending word first, which was itself a statement. The kind of casual disregard for basic courtesy that announces clearly who the arriving party believes himself to be in relation to the person being arrived upon. Pierce was broad and pink-faced, somewhere in his 50s, with the particular confidence of a man who had been the biggest presence in every room he'd entered for a very long time. He owned the 2 ranches that bordered Cole's property on the east and north, and he had Evelyn had gathered from various pieces of overheard conversation been attempting to acquire Cole's land through increasingly aggressive offers for the past 2 years. He came to the door while Evelyn was at the kitchen table working through the quarterly accounts. He looked at her when she opened the door, and his expression shifted through several things. Quickly surprise assessment, and something she recognized and disliked, the particular recalibration of a man deciding that the presence of a woman was information he could use. "Cole Walker here?" he asked. "He's in the east pasture. I can send word." Pierce leaned against the doorframe. "Who are you?" "Evelyn Harper. I manage the ranch accounts." "Huh." He looked past her into the kitchen with the unabashed inspection of a man who had never learned that other people's homes were not his to inventory. "Cole know he's got a woman going through his accounts." "Cole asked me to go through his accounts," she said. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Pierce?" "Just came to make an offer." He looked at her again, reassessing. "Cole's had a rough couple years. Drought losses. Staff trouble. A man in his position might be smarter to take a fair price for the land and start fresh somewhere easier. Cole's position, she said carefully, is considerably more stable than it was 90 days ago. Pierce's eyes sharpened. That's so. The quarterly accounts are in good order. The fall cattle sale is projecting well above last year's figures. The debt load has been reduced significantly. She held his gaze. So if your offer is premised on the assumption that Mr. Walker is in a position of weakness, you may want to revise your assumptions before you make it. A silence. Pierce looked at her with an expression that was trying to decide whether to be amused or irritated, and was landing somewhere between the two. You're very confident for a woman who doesn't own anything here, he said. I'm accurate, she said. Confidence is a byproduct. She heard boots on the path behind Pierce and Cole appeared, hat pushed back, reading the situation in the way of a man who had learned to read situations quickly. Roland, Cole said. His voice was even. His eyes went briefly to Evelyn's face, reading that too. Cole. Pierce straightened from the doorframe. Came to talk business, I heard. Cole looked at him without expression. The answer's the same as last time. The offer's better than last time. The answer's still the same. Cole stepped past Pierce and into his own doorway, making clear with the simple geometry of his body where the line was. Anything else? Pierce looked between them. His jaw shifted. Think carefully, he said to Cole. Man alone out here with debts and problems and... His eyes moved briefly to Evelyn complications. A fair offer doesn't stay fair forever. I'll remember that, Cole said. Safe ride back, Roland. Pierce left. Evelyn stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of his horse leaving the yard and felt something she had not expected to feel, not fear, not anxiety, not the familiar urge to calculate an escape route. Something closer to resolve. She turned and found Cole watching her. You told him the accounts were in order, he said. They are. You told him the debt was significantly reduced. It is. He was quiet for a moment. I haven't thanked you for that, not properly. You don't need to, Evelyn. His voice was firm, but not unkind. You saved this ranch. Not just the money, the position. Pierce has been circling this land for 2 years, waiting for me to be weak enough to take his offer. You took that away from him. He looked at her steadily. That deserves more than me nodding and moving on. She met his eyes and felt with startling clarity the specific weight of being seen by someone who was actually looking. I was here, she said. And I was useful. That's the whole story. He shook his head slowly. No, he said. That's not the whole story. He didn't say what the rest of the story was. He didn't have to. And Evelyn, who had spent years believing she was glass invisible, passed through, looked past, felt something in her chest that she couldn't name and wasn't ready to examine, warm and terrifying in equal measure, the sensation of a person beginning against all prior calculation to matter to someone in a way that went beyond usefulness. She went back to the accounts. But her hands were not entirely steady on the pen, and outside autumn was coming on fast across the Wyoming hills, turning everything gold and ruthless and beautiful in the particular way of things that don't last, which made you want to hold them tighter, which was exactly the problem, which was exactly what she had promised herself she would never do again. She heard his name before she saw him. She was in the dry goods store on a Wednesday morning, settling the month's supply account with Mrs. Calloway, when she heard 2 men talking near the door, not whispering, just talking with the casual volume of people who don't think anyone nearby is paying attention. Kane's in town, one of them said. Victor Kane. Came in on yesterday's stage. Evelyn's pen stopped moving on the receipt paper. What's he want out here? The other man asked. Don't know, but he's staying at the hotel. Asked Harlan at the front desk a lot of questions about ranches in the area. Asked about a woman traveling alone. The pen was still in her hand. She was aware of this fact with great precision. The pen in her hand, the receipt paper on the counter. Mrs. Calloway saying something she couldn't hear because the sound in the room had narrowed to a single sharp point. She signed the receipt. She picked up her package. She walked out of the store with her back straight and her pace measured, and she did not run because running was the confirmation of guilt, and she had nothing to be guilty of, and because she had told herself 2 months ago on a Wyoming hillside that she was done running and she had meant it and she was going to keep meaning it, even now when every instinct she had was telling her to get to the wagon, get to the road, get moving, get gone. She got to the wagon. She sat in the driver's seat and she made herself breathe. Victor Kane. She had known in the abstract rational way that a person knows things they would prefer not to know that he would look for her. Victor Kane did not accept the loss of things he believed he owned. He was not a man who shrugged and moved on. He was a man who had spent 40 years accumulating things, money, property, influence, people. And he catalogued his holdings with the meticulous attention of someone for whom the act of possession was itself the point. Her father's debt had made Evelyn a holding. She had never been anything else to Victor. Not a person with a name and a mind and feelings that registered on some meaningful scale. A holding. A line item in an arrangement that suited him. She had understood this. She had understood it clearly enough to walk out in the dark at 4 a.m. with a carpet bag and a plan she'd been building for 2 years. But understanding something clearly and being ready for it to materialize in the hotel 2 miles from where you were sitting did not turn out to be the same thing. She picked up the reins. She drove back to the ranch. She didn't tell Cole that evening. She told herself she needed to think first, to assess the situation, to determine what she actually knew versus what she feared, to avoid the mistake of reacting to something she couldn't yet see clearly. She lay awake most of the night, assessing and determining and seeing everything very clearly indeed. Victor was here. He had asked about ranches in the area. He had asked about a woman traveling alone. He knew where she was, or he was about to. He came to the ranch on a Friday. She saw him from the kitchen window before he reached the yard, a man on a very good horse dressed too well for the territory, with the particular bearing of someone who had never needed to hurry because the world in his experience waited. Her stomach dropped to approximately her boots. She turned from the window and went to the kitchen table and sat down and put both hands flat on the wood surface and breathed. Cole was in the barn. Hector and Pete were in the south pasture. She was alone in the house. She heard the horse stop in the yard. She heard him dismount. She heard his footsteps on the porch deliberate. Unhurried, the footsteps of a man who owned every floor he walked on. The knock on the door was formal, almost courteous. Almost. She went to the door and opened it. Victor Kane was 61 years old and looked 55, which was the kind of preservation that money and the absence of hard labor could purchase. He was tall, silver-haired, expensively dressed, and he had eyes the color of old iron, flat and functional, and completely without warmth. He looked at her for one long moment, with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man who has found something that was mislaid, and is making the internal calculation of how much trouble it is worth to retrieve it. "Evelyn," he said, as though they were resuming a conversation that had been interrupted, not ended. "Mr. Kane," she said. "You've led me a considerable distance," he said pleasantly. "I wasn't leading you anywhere. I was leaving. You left before we had the opportunity to finalize our arrangement." "I left," she said, "because I had no intention of finalizing that arrangement. I made that clear." "You made several things clear," he said, still pleasant, "none of which were legally binding. Your father's agreement with me was a contract, Evelyn. Signed, witnessed, documented." He tilted his head slightly. "I have copies." "My father signed a debt agreement," she said. "A financial contract. He did not have the legal authority to sign away a person. Courts have been known to interpret these matters differently. Courts have also been known to be wrong." Something flickered in his eyes. The pleasantness thinned. "You're living in another man's house," he said. "I'm employed on this ranch. People are saying otherwise." "People say a great many things." She held his gaze. She was proud of how steady her voice was, because her hands would not have been steady at all if they weren't pressed flat against her thighs where he couldn't see them. "What do you want, Victor?" "I want what was agreed to." The pleasantness was gone now, replaced by something more honest and considerably colder. "I want the arrangement your father promised." "I've been patient, Evelyn. I've spent 3 months and considerable resources locating you. My patience has limits." "Then I'll save you further trouble," she said. "The answer is no." It was no the night before the wedding, and it's no now, and no amount of patience or documentation or legal interpretation is going to change that. She met his iron eyes without flinching. "Good day, Mr. Kane." She closed the door. She stood on the other side of it and listened to the silence outside and the roaring in her own ears, and she thought with extraordinary clarity, "He is not going to leave." That was not a man who came this far to be told good day and go home. She was right. She heard his footsteps move off the porch. She heard him walk not toward his horse, but toward the barn. She moved. She came around the side of the house in time to see Cole emerge from the barn with a work glove still on one hand, reading the situation in his yard, the way he always read situations quickly, quietly from the outside in. Victor had stopped 10 feet from the barn door. "Walker," Victor said. "That's right," Cole said. He pulled the glove off his other hand. His voice was even. "You're on private property. I'm aware." Victor looked at him with the particular assessment of a man pricing something. "I'm Victor Kane. I have business with the woman you've been harboring. She's an employee of this ranch. She's a woman under a legally binding contractual obligation to me." Victor's voice was smooth and entirely certain, the voice of a man who had made this speech before and found it effective. Her father entered into an agreement. She left before that agreement could be honored. I'm here to correct that. Cole looked at him for a moment. "She doesn't want to go with you," Cole said. "With respect, her preference isn't the operative legal question." "With respect," Cole said, and his voice had gone very quiet, the specific quiet of something with deep roots. "It's the only question that matters on this property." Victor's jaw tightened. "You're interfering in a legal matter. I'm standing on my own land talking to a man who showed up uninvited." Cole met his eyes. "You're welcome to consult your lawyers. You're welcome to take whatever legal position you believe you have. But today on this ranch, the woman you're looking for said no, and that's the end of the conversation." The two men looked at each other across the yard. Evelyn stood at the corner of the house and felt something she had not expected to feel. Something that was not relief exactly, because relief implied the threat was over, and the threat was absolutely not over. What she felt was something harder and more complicated than relief. The sensation of being stood beside rather than stood in front of. The distinction mattered enormously, and she filed it somewhere in her chest, where she would find it later. Victor looked at her. He looked at Cole. He made the calculation she could see him making behind the iron eyes. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Cole said. "I expect it isn't." Victor mounted his horse and rode back toward town. Cole watched him go. Then he turned and looked at Evelyn. "Tell me all of it," he said. So she did. They sat at the kitchen table until the light changed and the evening came on, and Pete knocked to say the horses were fed, and Hector had started supper if anyone was hungry. Cole told him they'd be in shortly, and Pete disappeared. Evelyn told Cole everything. Not the careful edited version she had been carrying, not the version where she was simply a woman who had escaped a bad situation and moved on. The full version. Her father's business failures. The debt to Victor that had accumulated over years, while her father convinced himself it could be managed. The conversation she'd overheard when she was 24, standing in the hallway outside her father's study, when Victor had laid out the terms of the arrangement in plain language, and her father had agreed to all of them. The 2 years after that, where she had kept her face composed, and her plans quiet, and her savings hidden, building the margin she needed. The night she left, Cole listened. He did not interrupt. He did not make the sounds people make when they are only partially listening, the murmurs of acknowledgement that are really just waiting for their turn to speak. He was entirely present, and she could feel the quality of his attention, the way it held everything she said without flinching or editorializing. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The contract," he said finally. "Your father signed it?" "Yes." "Do you have a copy?" "No. I didn't take it when I left. I couldn't access his files without Victor knowing, but I know what was in it." She paused. "It was structured as a debt agreement with a personal clause attached. Victor's lawyers drafted it to make the personal obligation appear to flow from the financial one. It was designed to be difficult to contest. Cole turned his coffee cup in his hands. But not impossible. No, not impossible. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it for 3 years. The contract relies on the assumption that a person can be used to settle a debt. That premise has legal vulnerabilities, especially since my father died before the arrangement was executed. Death and changed circumstances complicate contract enforcement. She looked at the table. But Victor has resources and I don't. He can litigate indefinitely. I can't. What does he actually want? Cole asked. Not legally. What does he want? She looked up. Control, she said simply. He doesn't love me. He never pretended to. He wants what he believes was promised to him, and more than that, he wants the satisfaction of the account being settled. He's a man who counts things. She paused. He's been counting this for 3 years. Cole was quiet again. When he went back to town tonight, he said, he went back to plan, not to leave. Yes, he'll use money first, work through Roland Pierce probably. Pierce would love a reason to cause trouble for this ranch, and Kane's the kind of man who finds those alignments useful. He set down the cup. And he'll work the town. Get people talking. Apply social pressure to make the situation uncomfortable enough that... He stopped. That you ask me to leave, she finished. He looked at her directly. That was going to be the end of that sentence, yes. It would be the rational choice, she said carefully. I've brought trouble to your property. You have no legal obligation to me. Victor has resources and will absolutely use them. The cost of standing beside me in this is real. Yes, Cole said. So if you want me to go? I don't, he said. Flat. Simple. Without deliberation, as though the answer had been waiting for the question. She looked at him. Cole, the cost of this, the cost of doing the right thing is still a cost worth paying, he said. That's not sentiment. That's just how I was raised. He pushed back from the table. And beyond that, you fixed my books. You faced down Roland Pierce in my doorway. You've spent 2 months making this ranch run better than it's run in 3 years. His eyes were steady. You don't owe me for that. But I'm not going to repay what you've done here by sending you back out on the road when a bully with lawyers decides to make your life difficult. Evelyn sat very still. She had a response prepared, something measured, something that acknowledged what he'd said while keeping the appropriate weight of practicality on the table. She had prepared this response because she had anticipated something like this conversation, and she liked to be prepared. The response didn't come. What came instead was the specific and inconvenient truth that no one, not her father, not anyone she had known in her adult life, had ever looked at what she brought to a situation, and then at the cost of standing beside her, weighed them against each other, and chosen to stay. She pressed her hands flat on the table so they would not shake. Thank you, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. He nodded and stood. I'm going to send a wire to a man I know in Cheyenne tomorrow. Attorney. Honest, which is rarer than it should be. We're going to need a full picture of what Victor's contract actually says before we decide how to fight it. He said we. She noticed that. She told herself she was just noting it as information. She noted it very hard. The town shifted against her faster than she'd expected. Not all of it, but enough. Victor Kane had arrived with money and the willingness to spend it on reputation, and reputation in a small town was its own kind of currency. By the following Tuesday, she could feel it when she went to Millbrook. The glances that were a degree cooler. The conversations that paused slightly when she walked into a room, the specific social temperature of a community recalibrating around new information. The information. Victor was distributing as best she could. Pieced together from fragments was a version of events carefully constructed to make Evelyn look like the transgressor. A woman who had broken a solemn promise. A woman who had fled her obligations. A woman of questionable character who had insinuated herself into a vulnerable man's household under false pretenses. Mrs. Calloway stopped being almost kind and became straightforwardly cold. Aldous Greer at the bank was professionally unchanged, but personally distant in a way that was new. At the feed supply, a man she'd seen a dozen times without incident looked at her and said just loud enough, "That's the Kane woman," and turned away. She carried all of it home and said none of it to Cole, and worked through the accounts with the focused attention of someone keeping their hands busy, because busy hands cannot shake. Hector noticed. He found her in the kitchen late one afternoon, staring at the ledger without seeing it, and he poured himself coffee and sat down across from her and said with the unadorned directness that was his particular gift, "Town giving you trouble?" "A little," she said. "Kane's got money," Hector said. "Money talks in small towns, always has." He drank his coffee. "Doesn't mean it's telling the truth." She looked at him. "People here have known Cole Walker for 10 years. Hector continued. "Cole doesn't say much, but what he says is true. People know that." He set down the cup. "When Cole Walker stands up for something, people pay attention. Even people who are currently listening to Kane's money." He looked at her with eyes that had seen a great many things and assessed them without judgment. "The question is whether Cole's going to stand up loud enough that the people who want to hear him actually can." She held Hector's gaze. "That's not something I can ask of him," she said. "No," Hector agreed. "It isn't." He stood up. "But he might do it anyway." He went back outside, and Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen with the ledger open in front of her, and she thought about the word "we," and about the cost of things, and about the particular terror of caring whether someone stayed. And 3 miles away in the Millbrook Hotel, Victor Kane was writing letters to the county commission, to his lawyers in Cheyenne, and to Roland Pierce, and in every letter he described the situation at the Walker Ranch as an obstacle, a complication, a thing to be resolved. He had never in 61 years described Evelyn Harper as a person. He was not going to start now. But Evelyn Harper was no longer the woman who had walked 30 miles with blistered feet, and no plan collapsing on a hillside, and expecting to wake up dead. She was something different now. She just hadn't fully realized it yet. The letter from Cole's attorney arrived on a Thursday morning, and it was worse than either of them had expected. James Holt, the honest attorney in Cheyenne, the one Cole had described as rare, wrote in the precise, unsparing language of a man who respected his clients too much to soften bad news. The contract Victor Kane held was not airtight, Holt wrote, but it was not easily dismissed either. Victor's lawyers had drafted it with specific care to bridge the gap between financial obligation and personal commitment, and while the legal ground was contesting, it would require time, money, and a judge willing to look past the surface structure of the document to the ethical rot underneath. Time and money were both in short supply. Cole read the letter at the kitchen table. Then he passed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it twice. She set it down. "He's not saying we lose," she said. "No, he's saying winning is expensive." "How expensive?" Cole named a figure. It was not a catastrophic figure, not for someone with resources. For a ranch that had spent the past 3 years clawing back from drought losses and staff theft. It was a number that sat on the table between them, like something with weight. Evelyn looked at the letter. "There's another way," she said. Cole looked at her. "Victor has been doing this for a long time," she said. "Longer than my family. My father's debt wasn't the first arrangement he structured this way. I knew of 2 other families in Cheyenne who had similar situations. Financial agreements with personal clauses, attached men who found themselves obligated to Victor in ways they couldn't easily document or dispute." She kept her voice level. "If those families still have their documentation, their original contracts, their correspondence, and if Victor's pattern can be demonstrated rather than just alleged, a pattern changes the nature of the case," Cole said slowly. "A pattern suggests systematic fraud. That's a different legal conversation entirely." She folded her hands on the table. "Holt said contesting my contract alone is expensive, but if other victims come forward, the cost distributes. And more importantly, the argument shifts from one woman refusing an arrangement to a man who has been defrauding families across the territory." Cole was very still. "Do you know where these families are now?" he asked. "One of them, the Mercer family, I believe they're still in Cheyenne." Martin Mercer had a dry goods business. He lost it around the time my father was in his worst trouble. I always thought the timing was not coincidental." She paused. "The other family I'm less certain of, but if Holt is in Cheyenne, He may know how to find them. Cole stood up. He crossed to the shelf above the fireplace, the same shelf where he'd kept the old Hargrove contract, the shelf where he apparently stored every document that had ever mattered, and he came back with paper and a pen and set them in front of her. "Write it down," he said. "Everything you know, every name, every date, every connection you can remember. I'll wire Holt today." She picked up the pen. Her hand was steady this time. What happened next took 11 days. And those 11 days were the longest and most precisely uncomfortable stretch of time Evelyn had spent since the night she left Cheyenne. Victor did not wait patiently while Cole wired attorneys. On the third day after the letter arrived, Roland Pierce filed a formal complaint with the county land office, alleging that Cole Walker's property boundary markers on the eastern pasture had been illegally repositioned. The complaint was almost certainly fabricated. Cole knew where his markers were and had the original survey to prove it. But a formal complaint required a formal response, and a formal response required Cole's presence at the county seat. And Cole's presence at the county seat for 2 days meant Evelyn was alone at the ranch with only Hector and Pete, which was exactly the kind of vulnerability the timing was designed to create. She understood the tactic immediately. She explained it to Cole the evening Pierce's complaint arrived. "He's trying to separate us," she said. "Get you away from the property and put pressure on me directly. While you're handling the land office complaint, Victor, or someone working for him, will come here." Cole's jaw tightened. "I'll have Holt file for a delay." "Don't." She shook her head. "If you delay the complaint response, it looks like you have something to hide. Go to the county seat. Handle it cleanly. I'll be here." "Evelyn." "I'm not running," she said. "I told you that. I meant it." She met his eyes. "And Hector and Pete are here. I'm not alone." He looked at her for a long moment. If anything happens, Hector knows where the shotgun is, and I know how to send a wire." She kept her voice dry. "We'll manage." He left the next morning. She watched the wagon disappear down the road and felt the specific chill of a person watching their particular source of steadiness right away. And then she turned around and went back inside, because standing at the door watching wasn't going to help anything. Victor came on the second afternoon. He didn't come alone this time. He brought a man she didn't recognize. Tall, formally dressed, carrying a leather satchel, who had the flat professional affect of a lawyer asked to witness something. He also brought, which was more alarming, the Millbrook town sheriff, a man named Calhoun, who had the uncomfortable expression of someone who had been persuaded to be present and was already regretting it. They arrived in a buggy in the early afternoon. Evelyn heard them from the kitchen and came to the door before they could knock. She looked at the three of them. She looked at the sheriff specifically. "Sheriff Calhoun," she said. "I didn't expect to see you here." Calhoun had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Miss Harper, Mr. Kane has filed a formal request for—" "I'm aware of what Mr. Kane files," she said. "What I'd like to understand is why the Millbrook sheriff is accompanying a private citizen to execute a private legal matter on private property when the owner of that property isn't present." Calhoun blinked. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Miss Harper, we're here to serve. I know what you're here to serve." She looked at the satchel. "And I'm telling you that the owner of this property is temporarily absent on county business and will return tomorrow. Any legal instruments you wish to serve can be served at that time with Mr. Walker present." She looked at Calhoun. "Unless you believe the law requires a woman to accept legal service while alone and without counsel, Sheriff. In which case I'd be very interested in reading the specific statute you're relying on." Calhoun opened his mouth, closed it. Victor's eyes had gone flat and cold. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." "I'm making it exactly as difficult as it legally should be," she said. "Come back tomorrow, Mr. Kane. Bring your lawyer, bring the sheriff if you like. But come back when Cole Walker is on this property, because these instruments will be reviewed with an attorney before they're acknowledged, and that attorney is James Holt in Cheyenne, who is expecting correspondence." She looked at him steadily. "I'd also mention that Mr. Holt has been in contact this week with the Mercer family in Cheyenne and with a Judge Warren Aldrich of the 4th District Court, who has expressed interest in certain patterns of contract enforcement in this territory." Something moved through Victor's face. It was not fear exactly. It was the specific recalculation of a man who has discovered that the board he thought he was playing on has more pieces than he accounted for. The lawyer murmured something to Victor. Victor was very still. "Where did you get that name?" Victor said quietly. "Mercer or Aldrich?" she asked. His jaw moved. "Tomorrow," she said. "With Mr. Walker present." She closed the door. She leaned against it on the other side, and she breathed slowly and deliberately for about 30 seconds. Then she went to find Hector. "I need to send a wire to Cole," she said, "and one to James Holt in Cheyenne." Hector looked at her face and asked no questions. "Pete," he called toward the barn, "get the horse." Cole came back that evening. Not the next morning. He'd received her wire at the county seat, settled the land complaint in a single session by presenting the original survey, and driven hard to be back by dark. He walked into the kitchen where Evelyn was sitting with Holt's written response spread across the table, and he looked at her with the focused attention of a man checking whether something important is intact. "You're all right," he said. "I'm all right." He sat down, and she told him everything, and he listened, the way he always listened, and at the end, he looked at Holt's letter for a long time. "Aldrich," he said. Holt actually reached Aldrich. Apparently the judge has been aware of Kane's methods for some time. He needed documented evidence from affected parties. Holt has the Mercers. She paused. "And he has my father's correspondence." I described what I remembered. Holt confirmed that the letters my father wrote to his business contacts in 81 and 82 describe the arrangement with Victor in terms that contradict Victor's current legal characterization. Cole looked at her. "You remembered specific letters your father wrote 4 years ago," he said. "I kept copies," she said quietly. "In the account ledger. The one I sold to the trading post owner outside Laramie for the leather binding." She stopped, looked at the table. "I've been sick about that since the moment I did it. I didn't know what was in the pages. I just needed to eat." The silence was brief. "Where was the trading post?" Cole asked. She looked up. 22 miles east of Laramie. A man named Gus Whitfield runs it. He didn't know what he was buying, he said so. He wanted the binding." She held Cole's eyes. "But if he still has it?" "Pete can make that ride," Cole said. He was already standing. "I'll send him tonight with a fair offer for the book. Cash." Cole. "Tonight," he said, "before Victor's people think to look." She hadn't considered that Victor might also be thinking about what her father's records contained. But she saw it the moment Cole said it. Of course Victor would know the ledger existed. Of course if he had been thorough in researching her movements, he might know she'd sold it. Cole was already at the door calling for Pete. She pressed her palms flat on the table. The ground beneath this whole situation was moving in ways she couldn't fully track, and she was a person who preferred to track everything. She breathed through that. Pete came back with the ledger 2 days later, and it cost Cole $40 a fair price. Pete reported, and Gus Whitfield had seemed pleased enough with the transaction, though he'd also mentioned that another man had been asking about old ledgers the previous week, which meant they had been approximately 6 days ahead of Victor's reach. 6 days. Thin margin. But enough. Evelyn spent an entire afternoon going through the pages she hadn't looked at in almost a year. The numbers she recognized. The account entries in her own hand and her father's hand. And on the back pages where she had tucked them between the inside back cover and the binding folded thin, slightly creased from travel, the copies of 4 letters. Her father's handwriting. Her father's words. Describing in the particular exhausted honesty of a man writing to an old friend who knew the full situation, the exact nature of what Victor Kane had offered, and what had been understood on both sides. The letters didn't constitute legal proof on their own, but they established context. They established that her father had not considered the arrangement voluntary on his side, that he had understood himself to be in a coerced position. That was the distinction Holt needed. She sat at the kitchen table with those 4 folded pages in her hands for a long time. Her father had not been a strong man. He had made choices she had spent years being angry about. But he had known what was being done to him. He had written it down in his own words to someone he trusted. And somehow those words had survived through a trading post outside Laramie, through $40, and Pete's hard 2-day ride, and had arrived back in her hands at exactly the moment they could do something. Cole came in from the pasture and found her at the table. He looked at her face. He didn't ask what she was feeling. He sat down across from her and waited. After a while she said, "He knew, my father. He knew the whole time what Victor was." "Yes," Cole said. "He just couldn't find a way out." "Yes." She looked at the letters. "I was so angry at him for so long, for making the agreement, for not finding another solution, for—" She stopped. "For leaving me inside it when he died." Cole said nothing. He was very present. "I'm still angry," she said. "I think I'm going to be angry for a while longer." She looked up. "But he tried to document it. That matters. He tried to leave a record of the truth, even when he couldn't escape what the truth described." Cole reached across the table and picked up one of the letters, not reading it, just holding it for a moment, acknowledging its weight. "That's worth something," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She took the letters back, carefully, smoothed the folds, and set them on top of Holt's correspondence. "I want to go to the town council," she said. Cole looked at her. "Not just Holt, not just the judge in Cheyenne. I want to stand up in Millbrook and say what I know directly to the people Victor has been working on for the past 3 weeks." She met Cole's eyes. "He's been shaping the story here, spending money on how people see me. I want to give them the actual story." "That's a risk," Cole said carefully. "If it goes wrong—" "If it goes wrong, the situation is roughly the same as it is now," she said. "If it goes right, Victor loses the social ground he's been buying, and that matters as much as the legal ground." She paused. "He's counting on me staying quiet. He always has. A woman who argues publicly is a disruption. A woman who stays home and waits for other people to fight for her is manageable." Her voice was steady, certain. "I'm not staying home." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "When?" he said. "The council meets Monday." "I'll be," he said. "Not I'll take you. Not I'll handle it. Just, I'll be there." She nodded. And somewhere in the hotel, 2 miles away, Victor Kane was writing another letter, and he was writing it with the confidence of a man who had always gotten what he came for. He did not yet know that the woman he had catalogued as a line item for 3 years had spent 11 days quietly assembling the evidence that was going to dismantle him. He was about to find out. The Millbrook Town Council met on Monday evenings in the back room of the courthouse, and it was not a large room. It held approximately 40 people when full. On this particular Monday, it held 63 because word had traveled, as word always travels in small towns, faster than horses and twice as loaded, that something was going to happen. People had rearranged their evenings. Men who hadn't attended a council meeting in 2 years found reasons to be present. Women who were not technically invited to speak came anyway, and stood along the back wall with the specific patience of people who have learned that the best way to be allowed into a room is to simply be in it before anyone thinks to object. Evelyn knew the count because she counted them when she walked in. Old habit. Her father had taught her, always know the room before you speak to it. She walked in beside Cole, not behind him. That was intentional. He did not guide her with a hand at her back, or in any other way that suggested she needed guiding. They walked in side by side and found seats toward the front, and she felt 63 sets of eyes making the same assessment they always made, and she let them look. Victor was already there. He was seated on the opposite side of the room near the council table with his lawyer beside him, and the expression of a man who has arrived early enough to shape the space before the conversation begins. He looked at Evelyn when she walked in, and his iron eyes did the calculation, and then he looked away, which was itself a kind of statement. The deliberate dismissal of a man who has decided the person across the room is not worth the acknowledgement. She had been dismissed by those eyes for years. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. Council Chairman Thomas Briggs called the meeting to order with the slightly harassed energy of a man who had planned a routine Monday and was now managing something considerably larger. He was a decent man, she had formed that opinion across several interactions, but decent men in difficult positions tended to look for the path of least disruption. And the path of least disruption here was not obvious. Victor's lawyer spoke first. He was precise and well prepared, and he framed the situation exactly as Victor had designed it to be. Framed a straightforward matter of contractual obligation. A woman who had abandoned a solemn agreement. A man who had come a considerable distance simply to correct an injustice. He used the word honor 4 times. He used the word obligation 7 times. He did not use the word person once in reference to Evelyn. Evelyn counted. When the lawyer finished, Briggs looked around the room with the expression of a man hoping someone else would take the lead. Cole stood up. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when a person stands who does not stand often. "Thomas," Cole said. His voice was unhurried and entirely without performance. "I've known most of the people in this room for a decade. I'd like to say 2 things before Miss Harper speaks." Briggs nodded carefully. "The first thing," Cole said, "is that I've employed Evelyn Harper on my ranch for 3 months. In that time, she found and documented over $800 in fraudulent account entries, recovered $60 owed to me by Hargrove that I didn't know I was missing, and improved the financial position of my operation enough that Roland Pierce's offer for my land is no longer even worth considering." He looked at Pierce, who was sitting against the far wall with an expression like someone chewing on something sour. "The second thing is this." He turned to the room. "A contract that treats a person as a commodity is not a contract any court in this territory should enforce. And any man who built his wealth by tying debt agreements to the personal freedom of other people's children." His eyes moved briefly to Victor. "Is not a man who gets to use the word honor in this room." He sat down. The silence that followed had a particular quality to it. Victor's lawyer started to run. Victor put a hand on his arm. Victor stood up himself. "Cole Walker," he said, "is a cattle rancher. He has no legal training, no standing in this matter, and a personal interest in the outcome that makes his opinions irrelevant." His voice was controlled and completely cold. "The contract exists. The obligation is documented. Whatever employment arrangement exists at the Walker Ranch does not supersede a legally executed agreement. Miss Harper owes—" "I don't owe you anything." Evelyn's voice was not loud, but it was the only voice in the room. She stood. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this with a distant, clear-eyed interest, the way you notice at the top of a very high place that you are not afraid. Something had settled in her on the walk to the courthouse. Something that had been shifting and finding its position for 3 months had finally arrived where it was going. She was not afraid of Victor Kane. She was not afraid of this room, or the 63 people in it, or the opinion of any of them. She looked at Victor, and she said it again quieter, which somehow made it land harder. "I don't owe you anything." She reached into the folder she had carried in and placed the first document on the table in front of Chairman Briggs. "This is a letter from James Holt, attorney, Cheyenne, outlining the legal history of Mr. Kane's contract practices across 4 families in this territory over the past 9 years. She placed the second document. "This is a sworn statement from Martin Mercer, formerly of Cheyenne, detailing a financial arrangement with Mr. Kane that followed an identical structure to the one used with my father." She placed the third document, the 4 folded letters, carefully unfolded and laid flat. "These are letters written by my father in 1881 and 1882, in his own hand, describing the nature of the arrangement with Mr. Kane, and specifically noting that the personal clause was presented to him as non-negotiable at a moment of financial crisis when he had no meaningful alternative." She looked up at the room. "Mr. Kane's lawyer used the word honor 4 times tonight. I counted." She kept her voice even. "I want to ask this room to consider what honor actually looks like. Because I'll tell you what it does not look like. It does not look like a man who waits until a family is financially desperate and then attaches a personal clause to a debt agreement. It does not look like a man who pursues that clause for 3 years after the debtor has died. It does not look like a man who comes into a community he has no connection to and spends money to shape how that community sees a woman specifically to isolate her and make her easier to coerce." The room was very still. "My father made mistakes," she said. He made them under pressure in fear without good options. I was angry at him for a long time. Her voice was steady. But I am standing here today because he tried to leave a record of the truth. And the truth is this: Victor Kane has been doing this to families for nearly a decade. Not one family, not two, 4 that we have documented, possibly more. She looked at Victor directly. His iron eyes were on her. The calculation behind them was running. She could see it running, the rapid reassessment of a man who had expected a frightened woman and had received something else entirely. "I'm not leaving this community," she said. "I'm not honoring a contract that was designed to coerce. And I'm not afraid of you." She held his gaze for one more moment. "Not anymore." She sat down. The room erupted. What followed was not orderly and was not brief. People talked over each other for 20 minutes, while Thomas Briggs attempted to restore some procedural shape to the meeting. Victor's lawyer made 3 additional arguments, each more strained than the last. Roland Pierce, apparently sensing which direction the wind was blowing, said nothing at all, which was its own form of answer. Mrs. Calloway, of all people, stood up and said in a tight, uncomfortable voice that she might have been hasty in some of her assessments of Miss Harper's character, which was as close to an apology as that woman was constitutionally capable of, and Evelyn accepted it with a nod, because she was not in the business of requiring people to perform their contrition. A man named Garfield, who ran the feed supply, stood up and said he'd done business with Cole Walker for 8 years, and he'd never been told anything by Cole Walker that turned out to be untrue and that counted for something in his estimation. Aldous Greer at the bank, who had been professionally distant for 3 weeks, cleared his throat and said that from a purely financial and contractual standpoint, the documents presented raised serious questions about the enforceability of Mr. Kane's claim. Each voice was a small shift. And small shifts, when they accumulate in a room of 63 people, become something larger. Victor sat through all of it with the stillness of a man who is doing very precise internal mathematics. His lawyer leaned over twice to speak in his ear. Both times Victor shook his head slightly. Near the end of the second hour, Briggs called for quiet and looked at Victor directly. "Mr. Kane," he said, "given the documentation presented tonight and the questions raised about the nature of the original contract, I'm going to recommend this matter be referred to Judge Aldrich in the 4th District for formal review. In the meantime, I'm asking that you refrain from further attempts to pressure Miss Harper or anyone associated with her, and that you allow the legal process to proceed without interference." He paused. "Is that understood?" Victor was quiet for a long moment. "I heard the recommendation," he said. It was not agreement, but it was the first time that evening his voice had carried no particular certainty, and that absence was its own answer. He left the meeting before it formally adjourned. His lawyer gathered the papers. His lawyer followed. The door closed. Evelyn sat with her hands folded on the table and breathed. Cole beside her said nothing, but his hand found hers under the table, brief, firm, and then gone, the specific communication of a person who wanted to say something and chose that instead. She looked straight ahead and let herself feel it. Judge Warren Aldrich arrived in Millbrook 18 days later, and his arrival was the kind that reshapes a room's atmosphere before the man himself has said a word. He was 68, white-haired, with the particular economy of movement of someone who had sat in judgment long enough to know that every gesture communicated something and therefore made each one count. He reviewed Victor's contract for 45 minutes in the courthouse, with Holt present by wire correspondence and the Mercer family's sworn statement on the table. He reviewed Evelyn's father's letters. He reviewed Holt's documentation of the 4 cases. Then he called Victor Kane before him. Evelyn was not in this room for that conversation. She waited outside on the courthouse steps with Cole, and the waiting had a different quality than any waiting she had done before. Not the waiting of someone braced for a blow, but the waiting of someone who has done what they could do and is prepared for whatever the outcome is. She had not been prepared for things before. Not really. She had managed and maneuvered and run, but she had not stood in place and prepared. It was a different feeling. Cole sat beside her on the steps, and they didn't talk much. He had a piece of rope. He was working a knot out of which she understood was not because the knot required attention, but because his hands needed something while he waited. After 40 minutes, Holt's wire representative came out and found them. "The judge has found the personal clause of the contract unenforceable," he said, "specifically on the grounds of coercive formation and the precedent established by the Mercer documentation." He paused. "He's also referred the broader pattern of Mr. Kane's contract practices to the Territorial Attorney General for review." Evelyn looked at the courthouse door. "Victor," she asked, "he's been formally notified. He'll face potential fraud charges in Cheyenne. His lawyers will manage that process." The wire representative paused. "He left the courthouse about 10 minutes ago. I understand he's ordered his bags packed at the hotel." Cole looked at Evelyn. She looked at the street, somewhere at the far end of it. Victor Kane was loading a buggy and leaving Millbrook, and he was leaving it smaller than he had arrived, not in the physical sense, but in the way that matters in the particular diminishment of a man who built his power on other people's helplessness, and has been shown in public that the power was always borrowed. She let herself feel that for one careful moment. Then she stood up and straightened her jacket. "Thank you," she said to the wire representative. He tipped his hat and went back inside. Cole stood up beside her. They walked back to the wagon. She climbed up to the seat. He climbed up beside her. The horse was patient in the way of horses who have been waited on before and expect to be waited on again. Cole picked up the reins and didn't immediately use them. "You all right?" he asked. She thought about the question honestly. "I think so," she said. "I think it's going to take a few days before I fully believe it." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I've been afraid of that man for a very long time. Fear that old doesn't just stop because the situation changed." "No," Cole said. "It doesn't." "But it will," she said. "I know that." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "It will." He clicked to the horse, and they drove home. Autumn came on fully, in the weeks that followed, the way Wyoming autumn comes, total, honest, and spectacular in its indifference to what you thought you were prepared for. The ranch settled into the rhythm of the season. The fall cattle sale went better than projected. Hector whistled more than usual, which Evelyn had come to understand was his particular register of contentment. Pete asked her one morning if she was planning to stay through winter, and when she said she didn't know yet, he went slightly pink and said he hoped so because she made better cornbread than Cole, and he didn't want to go back to Cole's cornbread. Cole, when she reported this, looked wounded in a way that was not entirely performative. "My cornbread is functional," he said. "Your cornbread," she said, "is a flat rock with butter." He looked at her for a moment with the almost smile she had catalogued so carefully over the past months. "Stay through winter," he said. It was not a grand statement. It wasn't meant to be, but it landed on her with the weight of everything it carried, the months of daily life and shared work and kitchen conversations that had gone on past the hour. Either of them strictly needed to stay awake, the evenings on the porch. The morning she had found him in the barn before dawn, unable to sleep, and he had not asked why she was awake either, and they had simply shared the early quiet without explanation. She had been telling herself with great conviction that she was not falling in love with Cole Walker. She had been telling herself this since approximately the third week, which meant she had been lying to herself for roughly 2.5 months, which was not her proudest record of self-honesty. "I'll stay through winter," she said. He nodded as though that were settled, and went back to the accounts she had been helping him review. But there was something different in the room after she said it. Not dramatic, not announced, just present. The way the truth is present when it finally gets to stop hiding. The evening she would remember for the rest of her life was an ordinary one. A long day. Fence repairs on the north pasture. A supply run to Millbrook, where Mrs. Calloway had been with visible effort noticeably warmer. Supper with Hector and Pete, and an argument about the proper technique for pickling that had gotten surprisingly heated before resolving into laughter. The dishes. The fire in the evening low and steady, and then Hector and Pete gone to the bunkhouse, and the house quiet, and the two of them on the porch in the cold night air, because neither of them had gone inside yet, and neither of them seemed to be in a particular hurry. Stars over Wyoming on a clear autumn night are not a subtle experience. They pressed down on the world with the entirety of their number, and the air was clean and cold and smelled of the season. Evelyn looked at them for a long time, "I never came here looking for love," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It was simply the truest sentence available in that moment, and she had spent enough time managing what she said to enough people that she was tired in the privacy of this porch of managing anything. Cole was quiet beside her. She could feel him thinking, not hesitating, just thinking in the careful way he thought about things that mattered. Then she felt his hand find hers. His fingers closed around hers slowly, with the specific intention of a man who is not performing a gesture, but meaning it, and she felt the warmth of his hand against the cold air, and she did not pull away. "Maybe not," he said. She turned to look at him. The Wyoming sky was enormous above them both. His face was the face she had learned to read over 4 months of close quarters and honest work, and shared difficulty the face of a man who had been lonely for years, and had decided carefully and without fanfare that loneliness was no longer his preference. His voice softened. "But somewhere along the way," he said, "you found mine." She looked at him. She thought about the hillside where she had collapsed, expecting to wake up dead. She thought about the water cup placed within reach. She thought about nobody pays for kindness, and the answer's the same as last time. And we said so casually over a kitchen table that it had taken her breath away. She thought about her father's letters folded in a ledger she had almost never seen again, and a judge in a courthouse and 63 people in a room listening to her speak without fear for the first time in her adult life. She thought about all the things she had told herself she would never do again. Trust. Stay. Believe that someone could mean what they said. And she thought about how the body and the heart and the spirit have their own wisdom, and how sometimes the most intelligent thing a person can do is set down the armor long enough to find out what they're actually protecting. She turned her hand over in his, held it properly. "I know," she said. He looked at her, that almost smile complete at last. They sat on the porch until the cold drove them inside, and neither of them said very much more, because some things don't require more words than they've already been given. They married in the spring, when the Wyoming hills were coming back to life in the yard of the ranch that Evelyn had first seen from a ridge with blistered feet, and an empty purse, and a will that had refused even at its most exhausted to stop. It was not a grand wedding. It was exactly the right size. Hector and Pete, a handful of neighbors, including Garfield from the feed supply, and with visible but genuine warmth, Aldous Greer. James Holt sent a letter that arrived 2 days before, and made Cole read it twice, and then set it down, and look at the ceiling for a moment. Mrs. Calloway sent a pie, which Evelyn accepted as the apology it was intended to be. Cole's attorney read a passage about partnership. Evelyn had written her own words, and she stood under the Wyoming sky and said them without notes, looking at the man across from her who had found her unconscious on his property and offered her water and a room without conditions, and who had stood beside her through everything that came after, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, which was the only place she had ever needed anyone to stand. She wore her mother's last piece of good jewelry, a plain silver pin she had kept through everything, through the road, and the hunger and the fear, and the long months of building herself back to solid ground. It wasn't much. It was enough. Cole's hand was warm and steady in hers when they made their promises, and she felt with the particular and irreversible clarity of a woman who has learned the hard way to know the truth, when she finally stands in it, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The ranch prospered. The debt became a memory. Hector stayed and Pete stayed, and the bunkhouse acquired a third occupant the following spring, a young hand named Thomas, who was 19 and afraid of horses, and learning with patient instruction to be less afraid, which Evelyn understood was a skill that applied to considerably more than horses. The story of Evelyn and Cole Walker would not be told in newspapers or recorded in any official history of Wyoming territory. It was too ordinary for that two damaged people, a stretch of difficult months, a lot of honest work, and the slow, real, unglamorous accumulation of a life built together. But in Millbrook for years afterward, people would remember the Monday evening in the courthouse when a woman stood up and said, "I don't owe you anything," in a voice that did not shake. They would remember it the way communities remember the moments that showed them something true about what they were capable of believing. And on the north porch of the Walker Ranch on quiet evenings, when the sky went wide and full of stars, a woman who had once expected to wake up dead would sit beside a man who had learned that loneliness was a choice and not a sentence, and they would hold the particular silence of people who have nothing left to hide from each other. She had never asked for love. He had never expected to give it again. And what they built together out of ledgers and honest work, and 4 folded letters, and 63 people in a courthouse room, and 1 glass of water placed within reach, was not the love of stories told to impress. It was better than that. It was real, and it was chosen, and it was theirs, built on the only foundation that ever holds truth, given freely between 2 people who finally, after everything, had learned that they were worth the risk of staying. You said Viet Lai Fan Hook Modo Ko Kit Ban Nai Cook Mang.